Hi, this is Mrs. Camp, and today we are taking a look at Unit 5.1 from AP World History Modern, The Enlightenment, the Age of Reason. Throughout this video, you'll need to pause and re-watch occasionally as you take notes. Any historical event has a context. Historical context is what was going on around the event. For example, in your SAQ on the plague, the passage was written in the context of the spread of the plague to Europe at a time when Europe was primarily Christian and superstition and religious thought was dominant. Jews were a different religion and a different culture, and they were seen as other, so they were easy to blame for the plague, and they were. So the passage took place in that context. The events in this unit take place in the context of the Enlightenment. To understand the events that occurred, we need to understand the ideas of the Enlightenment. We'll do so partly through your reading, partly through your lecture, and discussion in class. They are all important, so do not skip the reading or the lecture and think you can get what you need from only one or two of the modalities we will use to learn. So let's move on with our learning objectives. You will need to pause and write these down after I read them. Number 1. Explain the intellectual and ideological context in which revolution swept the Atlantic world from 1750 to 1900. And the second is to explain how the Enlightenment affected societies over time.
Let's take a look at what was going on in history. Okay, we're a time of change. We're starting over here with the idea of the Renaissance. We're looking at time as a progression. In the Renaissance, we have a time period where people are coming up with new ideas, a kind of a golden age of learning, a golden age of art in Europe. We've got people painting Mona Lisa. We've got all sorts of ideas and art going on here. Scientific revolution. Okay, so we're going from the Renaissance, which means rebirth of classical learning, onto the scientific revolution. Scientists are beginning to question traditional beliefs. They're using the idea of logic and reason. Empiricism, which is the idea that you have to be able to see something for it to be true. We've got logic and reason. We've got observation and experimentation. So we're moving on from the pretty painting of Mona Lisa to people putting stuff in beakers and conducting scientific experiments, which hopefully won't blow up the beaker. We're moving on again to the Enlightenment. Here, we're looking at a time of new ideas. So we've got people who are coming up with different ideas and sharing them as they talk with other people who share their ideas. Sometimes they get along. Sometimes they're not so happy with each other. Sometimes we end up with revolutions. So let's take a look at how the Enlightenment occurred, what it is. So we've got this progression, and people started saying, hey, if scientists can understand the physical world using reason, then we can use reason to discover natural laws that shape human experience. So during this time of change, we're going from tradition being central, religion being incredibly important, and very often that is state-sponsored, or you must be this religion in this state, especially because a lot of the governments had a system where rule came from God. God said this person or this person in their family should rule, and the ruler has the authority because God gave it to them. We're looking at a sense of community, moving towards individual. We've got patriarchal societies, which we've been talking about all year. We now have a new way of understanding the natural world. Looking at religion, what role does it have to play? What role should it play? We're looking at people as individuals, and those individuals, funny enough, they have rights. We're looking at political theories that are new. We're looking also at patriarchy and the development of feminism, and we'll talk about that not every Enlightenment thinker necessarily believed that the role of women should change. So let's take a look now at how the Enlightenment challenged political order, challenged social hierarchies. We're going to look at 4 specific spheres here. But before we go into that, I want you to stop. Remember that the learning objective talked about the context that the Enlightenment creates for revolutions. I want you to, when I tell you to stop, I want you to pause the video and in your notes write down what your definition of revolution is and then go beyond that and brainstorm what else could be a revolution and come up with different ideas of revolutions. So take a couple minutes and write that down in your notes, and then create this diagram that you're seeing here with the blank spaces for writing, because we're going to go through that, but having this in your notes will help you to understand and remember what this is. So go ahead and define revolution. Okay, so the Enlightenment challenged what was going on. We're looking at specific areas in this slide. Governments were challenging the way that governments got authority and were run, challenging the divine right of kings. King got power from God. Because God gave king power, king has power. And king can do whatever king wants to do, has absolute power. We're looking at that, and we're changing into a democracy. The ideas of the division of government power into 3 branches, which is a way of limiting the power. Baron Montesquieu came up with that idea. The idea that citizens elect government officials. You may think, wait, didn't Athens have democracy? They did not. They had a democracy where everybody directly had a say. Now we have the idea of representative democracy, where we elect people and they actually make the decisions. Looking at rights, okay, challenging the idea that as part of that absolute power, governments can do whatever they darn well please to the people. People have rights. We're coming up with the idea that people have these rights and they should be protected by the government, and it is not right, or rather it is wrong, to take them away. And as we'll go on to talk about, if you are not being treated well, if you're being abused, you have the right and actually the obligation to overthrow that government. So we have a situation where there's slavery, the African trade slave, as well as serfdom. Serfdom feudalism was strong and going in Russia. Okay, so here we are looking at the idea of, hey, wait, people are born free. They remain free. And that's how things should go. So we should free the people who are not freed. Some of this happened during this time, some of this didn't, and some of the consequences were not what people expected. Feminism. We're challenging the idea of patriarchy and men controlling most aspects of women's lives, coming up with the idea that women are people too. Looking at gender equality, equal opportunities, equal education for men and for women. Okay, so these ideas are being discussed. We're having conversations. We're having arguments. None of these things are necessarily implemented by any government. A lot of them over time are implemented, but that time period is longer than the time period of the Enlightenment. Here we're looking at the use of reason. So if we can solve those scientific ideas using reason, using the idea of empiricism, being able to measure and see that something happens, we ought to be able to apply it to individuals and apply it to the political state. We now have a belief, a rising belief in self-determination. You decide where your life is going, what you do. Belief in freedom, belief in individualism. We're going to look at these through several themes. We're going to look at it political. We're going to look at the idea of classical liberalism and the relationship between people and the government. Economic, part of the economic ideas fall into the classical liberalism, and we're looking at free market economics. And note, when I say liberalism here, that is not the same thing as today's liberals. This is classical liberalism in the time of the Enlightenment, which is not identical to liberalism in the United States today. Okay. We're also looking at challenges to religions. We'll take a look briefly at deism, and then socially we're going to look at relationship between people and gender roles. So let's take a look at the government. So we postulated a minute ago that the government was being mean to the people. This guy is crying a little bit because the government is coming down and ignoring his rights. This is the situation where we have the divine right and absolute power. Now, just because government has absolute power doesn't mean that they're taking away every right someone has. Being a little bit general here. Liberalism and natural rights. The idea here is that we should have limits on government. The idea of a constitutional government. A constitution is a written document that outlines the powers of the government as well as the structure of the government. Okay, looking at the idea of democracy. I have rights too. I have the right to free speech. I have that right to self-determination, which I just mentioned on the previous slide. The idea of secularism. Okay, secular is non-religious. So let's take a quick look here at identifying a few out of the many influential philosophers in the political sphere. So we've got Thomas Hobbes postulated that the natural state of man is war and advocated the idea of social contract. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, also social contract. John Locke, yet again, we've got the social contract that I'm going to explain, as well as tabula rasa. And then there's Voltaire, and he was very much against state religion. So let's take a look at the social contract thing. So Thomas Hobbes wrote, among other things, a treatise called the Leviathan, in which he postulates that people live naturally in a state of chaos and war. Life is not good. Life is short. Life is brutish. And we are generally unhappy. Everyone is existing for themselves. So here we have chaos, war, every person for themselves, lots of death and destruction. And Hobbes postulates, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau builds on this, the idea that people choose to solve this problem of chaos and war by choosing to form a government. Okay, the idea here is that people give up some rights in order to have a society that is peaceful and is ordered. Okay, the government provides for us a structure where we are able to keep our rights. We retain our rights. We give up some of our rights. For example, we don't have the right to go out and kill people. We agree to give up that right so that we could live in a peaceful and orderly society. Okay, that is just an example. We live in a country whose our Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, were all framed using ideas from the Enlightenment, and specifically the social contract. Under this theory, governments and laws are only legitimate when the people support them. You'll note at the top, I have a quote from Rousseau: "Man is born free, but he is everywhere in chains." So the idea now is that you are born in a state of freedom, but you're born into a world where people have, through the structure of society, put chains on you. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was a champion of the common people, but more specifically the common man. He did not believe in the ideas of changing the views or the roles of women, of educating women, of women having their own rights and their own power. But we'll go into that more later. Okay, life, liberty, and property. That's related to the social contract. John Locke came up with the idea of these natural rights, life, liberty, and property. You are probably more familiar with life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, which is how Thomas Jefferson wrote it in our Declaration of Independence. Yay, TJ. John Locke comes up with the idea that we have not just the right or the ability, but we are supposed to. We have an obligation here. We are obligated to overthrow an unjust government. So we want to go and kick them out with our boots. We have the responsibility to do that. In addition, the idea of tabula rasa, blank slate. People are born with a mind waiting to be filled by knowledge. We are born free, and we have the ability to determine our lives. Contemporary thought of the time was that your fate was pretty much determined by your ancestry. Here we have the idea that no, you are born an individual person. You're born a blank slate, and you're basically good, but society imposes on you limits and restrictions. Okay, economic. So this is a reaction to mercantilism. Stop for a moment and pause the video and write down what you remember of mercantilism and how the economy worked with the government there. Here we're thinking about the colonies that were being established by the Europeans in different areas of the world. Okay, so I just said that these economic theories are a reaction to that. Specifically, we have here the idea of laissez-faire economics. Laissez-faire, French, let it be. We often refer to it as hands off. what that means is that the government, it should not interfere in the economy. Someone who advocates laissez-faire economics does not want industries to be regulated by the government. They want things to be determined by the market. Our economy in the US right now is a mixed economy. We have a market economy, but we also have government regulation and some aspects that are part of the ideas that came up of socialism. Here we have, in this classical liberalism, government should stay out, should not limit businesses and what they can do, should not create or enforce laws about safety conditions or about the amount of hours you can have someone work, that the market takes care of everything. Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, which is kind of the main treatise of capitalism. And there he looked at the idea and talked about the idea of the invisible hand. The market corrects itself. The government doesn't need to get involved. It's going to work. Capital is being the system where the means of production, how things are produced, are owned by individuals. Businesses are run for profit. Religion. Here we're looking at deism. Your textbook gives a brief definition of that. What we're doing here is moving away from traditional understandings of religion. Looking again, taking a second look at the relationship between God and people. Here we have the idea of divinity or God, whatever you see as that power, sets the natural laws in motion, but does not then go interfere. This is likened to a watchmaker. The watchmaker creates the watch, makes it, sets it in motion, but does not intervene on the day-to-day running of the watch. It runs itself. The idea here, God set this up, but God or whatever spirit does not come in and change how things are on a daily basis. And in part of deism, the idea that scientific inquiry was more important than the Bible as a way to look at the world, evaluate the world, understand it. Okay. This quote by Thomas Paine, who you've probably heard about in 8th grade, but if you hadn't, you will hear about him again next year in a push, and then as a senior in government, because he wrote the pamphlet Common Sense, which was part of the American Revolution. Thomas Paine was a deist, and his belief very much was creation is the miracle. We don't have to we don't have to believe in these specific things. The idea is that we're here, and we're looking at the world through that lens.
So having looked at this, let's take this and put it in place with what's going on socially and especially right now politically, because we're going to be looking at revolutions, and I want you to think about what does this idea of deism mean for divine right monarchies. Please pause the video and brainstorm that for a moment, then restart it. Okay, I want you to think about Catholicism, religious expectations, formations of new countries. Think about how this applies to those. As we go through, remember, we're looking at our learning objectives, which are both to look at the context for revolutions and look at how the Enlightenment is affecting society. So let's move on to social, and we're going to look at the context for Enlightenment thinking. We had what was considered the cult, or is considered the cult of domesticity. Separate spheres, public and private. Women were to live in the private spheres in the home. Men were to live in the public sphere. So the things that this looked at really were the roles of women and what is considered virtuous. Piety. We're looking at the last bullet point here. Religion is valued because, unlike intellectual pursuits, it did not take a woman away from her proper sphere, the home, and because it controlled women's longings. Purity. That refers to virginity, which was thought of as a woman's greatest treasure. She could not lose that until the marriage night. She had to save it for her husband, and then when she was married, she had to remain committed only to her husband. Submission. Women were required to be as submissive and obedient as little children because men were regarded as women's superior by God's appointment. Again, we have the context of religion ruling this. Finally, we have domesticity. A woman's proper place was in the home, and her role as a wife was to create a refuge for her husband and her children. Cooking, needlework, rearing children, making beds, tending flowers, running the household were seen as naturally feminine activities, where things like reading, anything other than religiously related texts, or engaging in work, engaging in politics, any of that was heavily discouraged. When we start looking at men and male Enlightenment thinkers, we'll see that some of this is carried through and they believed this, and some of it they challenged. So we're going to start looking at Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau was concerned about equality among men, but not among women. Rousseau, like many of the first Enlightenment thinkers who were male, he had little inclination to change the role of or status of women. He believed that women needed to rely on men for their well-being because they were less rational. Men may have desired women, but they didn't need them to survive, while women both desired women and needed them to survive. Women's were to be wives and mothers. If we look at a quote of his, you'll see that he's discussing education and how men and women have different roles, and that then translates to education. Once it is demonstrated that man and woman are not and should not be constituted the same, either in character or in temperament, it follows that they should not have the same level of education. In following the directions of nature, they must act together, but they should not do the same things. Their duties have a common end, but the duties themselves are different, and consequently, also the tastes that direct them.
Rousseau, women are not rational, are not thinkers. They should just stay home and be in their natural place. Locke, no, women should get educated. They should receive education just as men do. Marriage is negotiable. Divorce is okay after you rear your children. And Locke praises women who are in public positions. But note that he still thinks ultimately the husband is still the head of the family because men are, in his words, abler and stronger. So the man is still in charge over the woman. He also discussed types of masculinity. He would praise what he would talk about as independent, rational man of commerce, the tender family man, and then would criticize what he referred to as warrior men of violence and irrationality. So you can see how this comes through the Enlightenment's lens of natural, irrational thinking. Where did these ideas get brought up? Where are they discussed? There are a couple of venues for discussion, coffee houses in England and France. The picture here is from England, and you'll notice that all of these people in here are men. Okay, salons, France and England, are a little bit different. That's the picture over here on the right. And if you take a look at this area, you can see that there are women as well as men here. Salons gave women the opportunity to voice their thoughts and to voice their thoughts safely. Both men and women could attend salons. However, the women were the people who ran them. Okay, in Paris, aristocratic upper bourgeoisie women ran the salons from their homes. They would set the tone, they would decide the topic, goals, and bring together writers, artists, philosophers, and other patrons together to have a discussion. This really did give women voice and reduce their marginalization and gave the women a way to exert leadership. Within the salon, however, there is a structure, and people would interact with people of other social classes by using certain modes of speech and behavior. So doing so would really decrease the risk of misunderstanding or insult that would come with someone from a lower class speaking with someone from a higher class. But one of the main ideas here is that the salon really brought different social classes together and gave women the ability to bring up ideas, have some control, and have a say in society.
So to jump back to context, remember the context of these movements and women's involvement. A woman's place was to be fashionable. If she was to be outside of the home, she would be proficient in social graces, eloquent, and demure. Society did not see it as acceptable for a woman to be as educated or more educated than a man or to share her opinions. A young woman or girl's education might include reading, embroidery, music, dancing, drawing, perhaps a little history and geography, maybe some conversational French, enough to be able to converse, but not too much to limit her marriage possibilities. In 1774, Dr. John Gregory wrote in his book, A Father's Legacy to His Daughters, quote, "If you happen to have any learning, keep it a profound secret, especially from men, who look with a jealous and malignant eye on a woman of cultivated understanding." There were women who spurned this. So in the 1750s, Elizabeth Montagu hosted salons in her home where women could discuss almost anything except politics. The emphasis was rational thinking and discussion, not limited by sex. Elizabeth Vesey and Frances Boscawen followed Montagu's lead. The members were a new kind of modern and intellectual women, and also men could and did attend the society. The women were accomplished, well-versed in lots of fields. They regarded themselves as virtuous and proponents for the art of refined and intellectual conversation. The principal aims were rational conversation. So also it is important to note that many of these women were aristocratic. Okay, we had the salons which mixed people in different parts of society, but this blue stocking society, these women who were going out and taking chances, they were generally women from the aristocracy. Elizabeth Montesquieu, Elizabeth Vesey are in these pictures. Over time, the term blue stocking became pejorative and was used to refer to intellectual or literary women. Men were becoming more strident, and it was a patriarchal backlash where men started using this term blue stocking in a term of ridicule. Well-known men such as Lord Byron, Samuel Taylor Coleridge scorned the blue stockings, and William Hazlitt stated, "The blue stocking is the most odious character in society. She sinks where she is placed like the yolk of an egg to the bottom and carries the filth with her."
Mary Wollstonecraft, she had this ongoing argument with Rousseau. You read her work and it's very obvious that she really detested his views of women. What she would highlight would be the idea that Enlightenment ideals of equality is not consistent with the current unequal relationship between men and women. She ties back to the idea that inequality, that people are born the blank slate. Inequality is not rooted in nature, but in man's construct, being the way we have set up society. She was a huge proponent for education for women, and also would, encourage people to become active in politics and businesses. She did not advocate just about any go out and do whatever job you want, but she had specific ones that she referenced, specific roles that she referenced. She wrote A Vindication on the Rights of Women, published in 1792. She was actually killed the following year. Her daughter, interestingly enough, Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. Mary Wollstonecraft, constant controversy with her book, and if you look through it, you can really see why and how this really would get some people up in arms. I have three excerpts here, a couple of which really are just quotes. If women be educated for dependence, that is, to act according to the will of another fallible being, and submit, right or wrong, to power, where are we to stop? Okay, fallible is someone who can do something wrong. We all are fallible, and the idea here is if we are educated to just do whatever he tells us to, where is this going to stop on the slope of being responsible and being virtuous? She said, I do not wish women to have power over men, but over themselves. That was something that was overlooked by a lot of people who opposed her. But she explicitly states this as part of her work. And then another part that also gives you a little bit of insight into her mind and what she was looking at. My own sex, being women, I hope will excuse me if I treat them like rational creatures instead of flattering their fascinating graces and viewing them as if they were in a state of perpetual childhood, unable to stand alone. I earnestly wish to point out in what true dignity and human happiness consists. I wish to persuade women to endeavor to acquire strength, both of mind and body. Olympia de Gouges wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Women and Women Citizens, which came after the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen in the time of the French Revolution. Here she says women are equal. Okay. Basically, you've got this document that says you have these rights. Women deserve those rights also. As part of the revolution, there's a National Assembly formed in France. She argued women have to be part of that. She went through and identified a long list of rights that should be extended to women. Okay, and she really encouraged women to think and look at how they were treated in society and to take action to remedy those injustices. She took action 2 years after the publication of the Declaration. She was found guilty of treason and executed. Yay, French Revolution. If you're curious, I put a link on here to an article that's just an overview of the Declaration of Rights of Women, but it has some of the rights that women should have, according to Olympia de Gouges. Freedom, slavery, and serfdom. Okay, Enlightenment thinkers talked about equality, believing in equality. They were increasingly anti-slavery. Not every single one was. Remember, there are people who have different ideas here. Legal slavery largely ended between 1780 and 1890. And views of other forms of coerced labor, as we will explore, become unfavorable. And this does not mean that there is no coerced labor. Okay. Serfdom. Looking specifically at Russia. The economy has changed from agrarian to industrial. Serfdom is based on an agrarian society, growing things, working and producing food and goods for the owner of the land. Now we're having industrialization. Serfdom is not essential. There start to be peasant revolts. And so those really were those two factors really pushed leaders towards reform. And Tsar Alexander II oversaw the largest single emancipation of bondage in human history, where 23 million serfs were freed. And part of why he did this was to avoid the peasant uprisings, peasant revolts, and to undermine them. So the idea is it's better to liberate the peasants from above, being the nobility, give them freedom, than to wait until they win their freedom by uprisings. Tsar Alexander, much like Catherine the Great and some of the other despots of the time, did some things that we considered enlightened, but they still had absolute rule. Unfortunately, the ending of serfdom and the ending of slavery does not necessarily lead to happy endings. Doesn't all turn out well. There's usually little improvement economically in the lives of former slaves. We've got dependent forms of labor that came out of this. What I'm talking about here are things like sharecropping, which when you look at the United States Civil War, you'll see that that is one of the ways that the South then had as part of their production. Slaves, when they're freed, not willing to work on the plantation, many areas, especially in the Caribbean and in South America, if you were a slave and you went there, you generally would die before you had kids. You die very early. So people don't really want to work those places. This led to people moving around the world, especially from India and China, in a large global migration. The Russian serfs, their lot does not get a lot better. Household serfs got their freedom, but they did not get any land, so they did not have a way to grow their own food. Serfs from private estates were given less land than they needed in order to survive. There was a redemption tax placed on the serfs, and it was so high that serfs would have to sell everything they produced to pay the tax, which meant that they had nothing for their survival. We've got a lot of civil unrest as a result of this, as a result of these different factors. Landowners suffered. Many of them were deeply in debt. They then would force the newly freed serfs to rent their land from the landowners, and the peasants would have to make labor payments, and often didn't have time to work in their own field. In addition, throughout the world, few gained political equality. Think about the United States. Even after the Civil War, we had segregation. We had Supreme Court cases that said segregation is legal. Racism, all of these things keep going. Later, we're going to take a look at the Haitian Revolution, however, which was the only successful slave uprising in history. Slaves rose up against their masters and took their lives into their own hands and freed their country. So we have the isms here, the ideas. We call them the isms because, as you can see, many of them end in ism. That sounds kind of stupid, but that is really why we refer to this as the age of isms, or the different isms. We've got empiricism. These are covered in your textbook. I've added to what's in the textbook, but have not addressed every single one of these here. If I have not talked about it in today's presentation, then you will find it in the textbook. Liberalism, and that was including both the political and economic. So we've got the political limited government and economic. We've got the laissez-faire economy without government intervention. That's the hands-off. And the idea of the market economy. Conservatism was a reaction to liberalism. Socialism and utopian socialism are related, but they are not the same. Be sure to cover that carefully. Abolitionism, or the end of serfdom, we've talked a lot about. There's a little bit different information in the textbook. And then the idea of Zionism, which is the idea of Jews going and having a Jewish homeland. That idea becomes more and more significant as we get to World War II, and then post-World War II with the establishment by the United Nations of the State of Israel, which was in large part, and I'm sorry, we totally messed up and let 6 million of you be slaughtered. That's the presentation of the Enlightenment ideas. Rewatch it if you need to. Make sure that you've taken notes. You can use them on the quiz. I will check them periodically. And be sure to make time to do the other ideas. The specific people I mentioned are some of the ones that will be in the speed dating. There are a whole slew of other thinkers who will be in that as well. Thanks.